Oh, absolutely. Okay, I'll start there. I'm happy you asked because I've been listening in to the whole conference today and I thought maybe I should have been up first because I think that the SDGs really work so well to frame the conversation. Of course, several of the speakers have referred to the SDGs. So the lab, in essence, is what we could call a partnership catalyst. So catalyzing partnerships for the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, what has been very clear in the conversations today is that the SDGs does the job of bringing together all these extremely complex issues that people today have been speaking about. And so someone referred to SDG 17. Now, of course, partnerships go throughout. And when, about 5 years ago, the lab was created exactly to do that, to bring together people working across organizations in Geneva, working across different topic areas on the SDGs to catalyze partnerships for the SDGs. And I'm happy to speak more specifically around one on sustainable finance that is probably the more mature, but we can go into that later.
All right. As long as you promise that we will go into that later.
We can come back, yeah.
So the UN put together these kind of pillars, now represented in these boxes, but I don't think the UN's plan ever was to, on its own, unilaterally solve the world's issues, correct? This is an ecosystem play.
Absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
So why ecosystem? Why does this, I mean, it seems like an obvious question, but maybe you can point out what the benefits are of these different shareholders and stakeholders coming together and why it has to be a cumulative effort.
So let me just take you one step back there, and I was thinking about that, you referring to them as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It really is our Sustainable Development Goals, and yes, it's been adopted in the UN, but it's adopted by member states with input from civil society, with input from businesses, and honestly with input from quite a broad group of stakeholders. So we take what we call an ecosystem approach, and it's very known that a lot of organizations struggle to work across issues. So ultimately the SDG Lab leverages what's called a Geneva 2030 ecosystem. It's a network, essentially, of around 350 individuals, but individuals who work at UN entities, who work at NGOs, who work in the private sector businesses in Geneva. And so really a network approach is recognizing the benefit that we have of bringing people together in an ecosystem, a potential chain of impact, if you will, because people need spaces where they can come together informally, where they can come together to collaborate. That's not the formal hallways, that's not where they make the statements at the UN, but where they can have honest and frank conversations. So that's the kind of space that we aim to provide with the network that we mobilize. So on practical terms, it's quite simple, if you will. We have a collective chat. We bring together people over coffee. On a more regular basis, we convene conversations around, for example, the topic of digital solutions for the SDGs, around data for the SDGs, various subgroup discussions around that. And really, the way that we do it is through co-creation in the sense that we're not the ones deciding what we bring up. We really take that from the entire community to give input into what it is that we need to discuss. So then coming back to the issue of sustainable finance, this is one of the areas where several years ago a conversation started within the ecosystem that the SDG Lab convenes. And it was really bringing together the UN entities with the finance community in Geneva, recognizing the potential of bringing together those communities. And that resulted in what today is the Building Bridges conference, which I think a previous speaker mentioned. So that's just one example, but we're exploring several other areas. And we see, we of course on a day-to-day basis, see the value that this actually brings to people. But you're probably going to ask me about challenges, and for sure a challenge is measuring the impact of networks. So that's something that we're working on, and I think the important thing is the recognition that partnerships takes effort, and especially sustaining partnerships. So while I'm not revealing any big new secrets, I think the secret is that it takes a lot of effort. It's not just one-off connection, and that's where the ecosystem approach comes in, is that we're there to make sure that we continue the conversation, to make sure that we facilitate the connection that's been established. We don't hold on forever, so it is really a lab in the sense that it's where things are incubated and then we let go.
Nice. Before we talk about the challenges, 2010, I happened to be in Ireland in the middle of what was a crisis, a recession. And the government decided they wanted to put together a committee, 7 of us, none of us bureaucrats, to solve the crisis. And that eventually became the National Policy on Entrepreneurship. But what was different is they decided they want an ecosystem play. So rather than trying to figure out how to create a more entrepreneurial, innovative, by bureaucrats saying we need these taxes, we need this, they wanted to get it from people. And so they got people like me and others on it. So there were 7 of us, and when we decided the pillars of a good ecosystem, one of those was inclusion. We want to make sure that everybody had a role to play. This was not the government's problem, this was not the investors' problem, this is not the entrepreneurs or the co-working spaces. Everybody had a role to play. So that was one important thing, is inclusion. Second was ownership. We didn't want to be the gatekeepers. We didn't want someone coming to us and saying, hey Dan, can you sign off on this project? We said, look, Ireland will grow if we do these things. Now, who wants to take and run with it? So we didn't want to be gatekeepers. We want to provide ownership for people. So we had these pillars of what we thought was a vibrant, strong ecosystem. For you, as you think about building ecosystems, what do you think are some of those pillars, those necessary ingredients to have a good ecosystem?
I would say an obvious one is trust. So it's obvious, but it's difficult. Building trust, I come back to the informality. So for us, it's really a key feature of the ecosystem is that it's informal. It's people meeting as people. It's not people meeting with their name tags and their titles. So a lot of the things that what we do is that it cannot feel like work. So for example, we convene community coffees on the way to work. It's not, you don't come in with wearing your hat or your title or your organization, but we do, of course, hope that people find this useful and bring it back. So I think informality is definitely one of our pillars. Another thing is that it has to be relevant, it has to be useful for you. So you have to have that sense that you can shape the activities or that you have the ownership. And this is something that's quite frankly challenging. When you work with something that's as broad as the Sustainable Development Goals and you have a network of 350 individuals who are working on different areas, how do you find that focus? So a way in our community that we're convening is that not everyone has to convene around the same themes necessarily, but we try to convene around what we call enablers. So for example, here we have the data, the digital, and the finance. So that means we can dive into specific themes, but it continues to be relevant for more people because it's related to issues of measurement, issues of finance that might be relevant to you even if it's not the specific theme you're working on. So informality, ownership, flexibility, the chance to shape things, I think would be the 3 key for us.
So now we talked about what makes for a good one. What have been some of those challenges in getting there?
Well, I think engagement for sure, right? So, and COVID, of course, has been, a difficult path for I think a lot of us. So maintaining engagement. I think when the SDG Lab and the network was launched 5 years ago, there was a big excitement around coming together around the SDGs. But then once you figure out, well, this is a super broad and complex agenda, now we're all here, what's the next step? So I think the challenge for a network is that networks are a constant evolving target. It's never the same. It's never static. You always have new people joining. You have people leaving. How do you adapt it? How do you keep it relevant for the people who are currently active? So I think a weak network, if I might say, is someone where you're not constantly checking in, constantly trying to act as that person that reintroduces, reconnects, and focus on adaptation.
And maybe one more question on this. Is this replicable, or is this a one-off in historical moment where you have all these individuals coming together and entities coming together?
I think it's absolutely replicable, but I think, of course, it will be different in every context. And it's, of course, a good question because we do have something that we call the Sdg Lab Learning Journey. So this is a tool you can go online. What it does is not prescribe how to do it necessarily, but it tells the story of how we set up an Sdg Lab, how we curated this network, steps, questions to ask yourself as you do so. So you can look it up, Sdg Lab Learning Journey. It'll walk you through the ecosystem approach that we've taken. And maybe just as a final remark on that as well, I should have mentioned that the lab and the network in itself is a multi-stakeholder partnership. So it's between the UN and an international NGO that this is convened, which I think is one of the power as well, because that brings in that diversity.